just outside Paris, where kings once ruled and revolutions were born, stands one of the most magnificent palaces in the world, the Château de Versailles, a symbol of absolute power, beauty, and history. This palace transformed from a simple hunting lodge into the heart of a kingdom. Today, we begin a journey through its golden halls, secret chambers, and legendary gardens. Welcome to Versailles. Long before Versailles became a palace of gold and mirrors, it was nothing more than a quiet piece of land, wet, marshy, surrounded by thick forests, and home to small villages and farms. The land was isolated, far from the noise and politics of Paris. In the early 1600s, few people paid attention to this place. It was calm, peaceful, and known mostly for its abundance of wildlife, especially deer and boar. In 1623, King Louis XIII, the father of Louis XIV, decided to build a small hunting lodge here. He was a quiet and reserved king who loved the solitude of hunting more than the crowded halls of the Louvre Palace in Paris. The hunting lodge he built was simple, nothing like the grand buildings we think of today. It was made of red brick and stone, with a few rooms, a stable for horses, and space for his closest companions and guards. The location of Versailles was chosen carefully. It sat on slightly higher ground, which made it easier to spot animals during hunts. From this point, the king and his hunting party could see the forest stretch for miles. The air was fresh, the silence was comforting, and the king found peace there away from political stress and the pressures of ruling. At the time, the surrounding area belonged to various noble families, particularly the Gondi family. King Louis XIII had to purchase the land bit by bit to expand his estate. He began buying farmland, forests, and small houses from local nobles and villagers. Slowly, Versailles became royal property. By 1631, Louis XIII decided to rebuild his hunting lodge into a slightly larger residence. It still wasn't a palace, just a modest house with two small courtyards, narrow corridors, and wooden beams. The Queen Anne of Austria visited only occasionally. The lodge remained mostly a private retreat for the king and a few trusted servants. Despite its simplicity, the lodge held a special meaning for Louis XIII. He even spent several nights there during important moments of his life. In one famous story, he nearly died of illness at Versailles, and after recovering, he asked for a small chapel to be built in thanks to God. That small chapel would later inspire the grand royal chapel inside the palace. No one could have imagined that this quiet retreat would one day become the center of French power. When Louis XIII died in 1643, his young son, Louis XIV, inherited the throne. As a child, Louis XIV visited Versailles and fell in love with its forests, its fresh air, and its peaceful isolation. He remembered the feeling of freedom he experienced their way from the dangerous politics of Paris. These early memories planted a seed in his mind. Years later, when he became the absolute ruler of France, he would return to this simple hunting lodge not to escape, but to transform it. What once was a quiet brick house surrounded by marshland would become one of the most extravagant palaces the world had ever seen. But in the beginning, Versailles was just that, a humble lodge in the middle of nowhere, a place of silence, forests, and royal hunts, a place no one thought would become a symbol of royalty, luxury, and absolute power. When Louis XIV ascended to the throne of France in 1643, he was only 5 years old. France was ruled by his mother, Queen Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. During Louis's childhood, the royal family experienced political chaos and uprising. Nobles rebelled against the royal power in a series of civil wars called the Fronde. The young king never forgot the fear, the betrayal, and the instability of Paris. These memories shaped his future decisions. By the time Louis XIV took full control of the government in 1661, after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, he had a clear vision. He wanted to build a kingdom where no noble, no parliament, and no rebellion could ever threaten his power again. He believed in absolute monarchy, the idea that the king is chosen by God and holds all authority, and he wanted a palace that would reflect that power. Louis XIV was known as the Sun King. He chose the sun as his symbol, representing light, power, and life. Just as the sun is the center of the universe, he wanted to be the center of France. In his mind, everything should revolve around him: culture, art, even daily life at court. At that time, most kings ruled from the Louvre Palace in Paris, but Louis XIV wanted something different, something that belonged entirely to him. He remembered the peaceful hunting lodge at Versailles, where his father had once found solitude. It was far from the gossip, riots, and politics of Paris. He saw potential in that quiet place. In 1661, Louis XIV decided to transform Versailles into a grand palace, a symbol of his absolute power and the glory of France. It was an ambitious plan. Versailles was still small, surrounded by swamps and forests. It had no large water supply, no housing for thousands of courtiers, and no grand architecture. But Louis XIV didn't see problems, he saw opportunity. He hired the best minds of France. Architect Louis Lavav was chosen to expand the original hunting lodge. Painter and designer Charles Lebrun was responsible for creating magnificent interiors filled with paintings, carvings, and gold decorations. Landscape architect André Lenentre was tasked with designing gardens unlike anything the world had ever seen. Louis XIV was personally involved in every decision. He inspected designs, corrected drawings, and even chose the themes for ceiling paintings. He wanted every room to tell a story about his power, wisdom, and divine right to rule. He wanted Versailles to impress not only French nobles, but also kings and ambassadors from around the world. To achieve his dream, the king needed money, and a lot of it. He collected taxes from the people, borrowed from wealthy bankers, and used France's wealth to fund construction. Thousands of workers, artisans, soldiers, and even prisoners were brought in to build the palace. Many of them worked in harsh conditions, under rain, sun, and freezing winters. As Versailles grew, Louis XIV made an important political move. In 1682, he officially moved the royal court and government from Paris to Versailles. Ministers, diplomats, and noble families were forced to live in the palace. By doing this, the king controlled everything. Nobles spent their days trying to gain his favor instead of plotting rebellions. Versailles became not only a palace but the beating heart of the French monarchy. Louis XIV's vision was successful. Versailles became a symbol of French art, culture, and power. It inspired kings across Europe. It showed the world how one man could turn a simple lodge into a golden dream and a tool of control. Yet, behind the beauty, the golden mirrors, and the grand halls, Versailles was also a place of surveillance, politics, and endless wealth consumption. But for Louis XIV, it was exactly what he wanted, a stage where he was the center of everything, the Sun King, shining forever, transforming Versailles from a modest hunting lodge into a grand symbol of monarchy. Was one of the most ambitious architectural projects in history. It was not built in one day or 1 year. Construction took decades, evolving through multiple phases under the reign of King Louis XIV. When the king gave the order to begin construction in 1661, the hunting lodge of Louis XIII still stood at the center. Instead of destroying it, architect Louis Levauve cleverly built around it, turning the old lodge into the core of a much larger palace. This first phase added 2 symmetrical wings and a large terrace facing the gardens. But as the king's vision grew, so did the palace. After Louis Levauve's death, architect Jules Hardouin-Mansart took over and expanded Versailles to an even grander scale. He designed the Hall of Mirrors later, the north and south wings, the royal chapel, the Grand Trianon, and many of the palace's most recognizable features. Building Versailles was not just about architecture, it was about power, control, and showing the world the strength of France. Tens of thousands of craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, marble workers, blacksmiths, and painters were employed. Soldiers, farmers, and even prisoners were forced into labor. Many workers lived in temporary camps around the construction site, enduring mud, harsh winters, disease, and lack of clean water. Materials were sourced from across France and beyond. Marble was brought from the Pyrenees, stone from quarries near Paris, and exotic woods from distant lands. Tons of gold leaf were used to decorate statues, railings, and ceilings. Mirrors, extremely expensive at the time, had to be produced in France, as importing them from Venice was costly and politically sensitive. Water was one of the biggest challenges. The fountains and gardens of Versailles required massive amounts of water, far more than the natural surroundings could provide. Engineers built reservoirs, aqueducts, and canals. The most ambitious project was the Machine de Marly, a gigantic water pumping system that would lift water from the Seine River uphill toward Versailles. It was one of the most advanced engineering achievements of its time. Inside the palace, every room was designed not for comfort, but for glory. Charles Lebrun, the chief decorator, filled ceilings with mythological scenes portraying King Louis XIV as a godlike figure, Apollo, the sun god, or Jupiter, ruler of the heavens. Walls were covered in silk, gold embroidery, and paintings celebrating France's victories. Even doorknobs, fireplaces, and window frames were carved with crowns, fleurs de lis, and royal emblems. The king's apartments were the center of court life. The king's bedchamber, located at the very center of the palace, symbolized that all life and power radiated from the monarch. Even waking up and going to bed were ceremonies, with nobles invited to watch the king dress or undress in a ritual called the lever and the couture. Construction never truly stopped. Every year, new halls were built, gardens expanded, fountains added, and decorations improved. The palace was constantly changing, growing more luxurious and more expensive. But Versailles was more than a home. It was a political instrument. It was a stage where Louis XIV performed his power. Ambassadors from other countries walked through its long corridors. Stunned by the gold, the marble, and the endless rooms, nobles spent fortunes on clothing, jewels, and etiquette just to impress the king. Artists, musicians, and writers were brought to Versailles to glorify the monarchy. In the words of one foreign visitor, Versailles is not a palace, it is a world of its own. And that is exactly what Louis XIV wanted, a world where everything reflected him, praised him, and depended on him. Among all the rooms inside the Château de Versailles, one stands above the rest not just in beauty, but in historical importance. This is the Hall of Mirrors, or La Galerie des Glaces, the heart of royal power and one of the most iconic rooms in the world. The Hall of Mirrors was designed and built between 1678 and 1684, under the direction of architect Jules Hardouin-Mansart and artist Charles Lebrun. Louis XIV wanted a grand gallery that would impress foreign ambassadors, noble families, and anyone who stepped inside the palace. He wanted a room that reflected his glory, his success, and his power. And so, he ordered the creation of this masterpiece. The hall stretches 73 meters long, 10.5 meters wide, and 12 meters high. One side is lined with 17 large arched windows that overlook the magnificent gardens of Versailles. On the opposite side, directly facing these windows, are 17 matching arches, each filled with towering mirrors. In total, there are 357 mirrors in the hall. At a time when mirrors were extremely rare, expensive, and mostly made in Venice, this was a bold statement of wealth and innovation. The decision to produce the mirrors in France, rather than importing them from Venice, was political. Venice held a monopoly on mirror making, but Louis XIV wanted France to become the leader of luxury and craftsmanship. French artisans were trained in the secret techniques, and the Manufacture Royale des Glaces Royal Mirror Factory was created. This was the birth of Saint Gobain, a company that still exists today. The ceiling of the hall is a masterpiece by Charles Lebrun. It is divided into 30 painted panels, each glorifying the reign of Louis XIV. These paintings show his military victories, diplomatic achievements, and his belief in absolute monarchy. The king is often shown as Apollo, the sun god, or as a heroic leader, chosen by God to guide France. Every figure, every cloud, and every beam of light was carefully painted to celebrate his greatness. The hall is lit by 17 golden chandeliers and 24 candelabras placed along marble pilasters. When candles were lit at night, their flames would reflect off the mirrors and the gold decorations, creating a magical glow that made the room appear endless. But the Hall of Mirrors was more than just beautiful, it was a stage for power. This was where the king walked every morning from his private apartments to the royal chapel. Courtiers lined up and bowed as he passed. This was where grand balls, royal weddings, and diplomatic receptions were held. Nobles dressed in their finest clothing, hoping to catch the king's eye. One of the most famous events in the hall occurred on June 28, 1919. After 4 long years of World War I, world leaders gathered in the Hall of Mirrors to sign the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty officially ended the war and drastically reshaped the map of Europe. The choice of this hall was symbolic. Germany was forced to sign its defeat in the very room where the German Empire had been declared. In 1871, the Hall of Mirrors also witnessed personal moments. Royal children were baptized here. Princesses of France were married here. Musicians like Lully and Couperin played during grand festivals. Even Marie Antoinette walked these halls, unaware of the revolution that would soon uproot her world. But for Louis XIV, this hall was not just a place for events. It was a reflection of his power. The mirrors symbolized the light of the Sun King. The windows opened to the gardens, representing his control over nature. The paintings on the ceiling told stories of his greatness. It was a room designed to make everyone feel small, standing in the presence of a king who is greater than all. Even today, when visitors walk through the Hall of Mirrors, they are filled with awe. The silence, the reflections, the painted heavens above all, remind us of a time when Versailles was the center of the world, and the king was the sun. Life inside the Palace of Versailles was a world of ceremony, elegance, competition, and silent power struggles. It was unlike any other place in Europe. Versailles was not just a royal residence, it was a stage where every person played a role. Every gesture held meaning, and every day followed strict rituals designed to glorify one man, the king. The daily routine began at sunrise with La Lavardou Roi, the king's rising ceremony. This was not a private moment. It was a public performance of power. Only the highest-ranking nobles were allowed in the king's bedchamber as he awoke. Some had the honor of handing him his robe or placing his shoes. Others could only watch from the back, hoping one day they might be invited closer. To dress the king was not a servant's duty, it was a privilege. After dressing, the king would walk through the Hall of Mirrors to attend mass at the royal chapel. Courtiers lined the halls to greet him, bowing respectfully as he passed. Even this simple walk was a display of hierarchy. Of those standing closest to the path were the most powerful. Those further away were ignored. Meals were also ceremonies. During the grand cover, the king and royal family ate dinner in public. Nobles, ladies-in-waiting, diplomats, and even ordinary visitors could stand and watch. The table was filled with silver dishes, roasted meats, pastries, and exotic fruits. Musicians played softly while servants moved like shadows. The king rarely spoke. His presence alone communicated authority. Versailles housed thousands of people, nobles, servants, soldiers, cooks, musicians, artists, and guards. The noble families, known as courtiers, lived in apartments inside the palace or in nearby buildings. Their rooms were often small, cold, and lacking privacy, but they accepted this because living near the king meant influence, rewards, and proximity to power. Status at court was everything. A single smile from the king could mean a title, a pension, or a powerful marriage. A frown could mean exile. Nobles spent fortunes on clothing, jewelry, perfumes, and wigs to stand out during ceremonies and balls. Fashion became a weapon. Women wore heavy gowns with wide skirts and towering hairstyles. Men wore silk coats, lace cuffs, and high-heeled shoes with red soles reserved only for royalty and high-ranking nobles. Versailles was also a world of rules called etiquette. There were rules for how to bow, how to speak to the king, how to sit, how to walk, even how to knock on a door. Breaking etiquette could ruin a noble's reputation forever. Some people were allowed to sit in the presence of the king. Others had to stand. Each privilege was carefully recorded and never given lightly. Entertainment was constant. Louis XIV loved art, theater, music, and dance. He himself was a talented dancer and once performed as the sun god Apollo in a famous ballet. Throughout the year, Versailles hosted masked balls, operas, concerts, hunting parties, feasts, and fireworks. The gardens were filled with musicians hidden among the trees, fountains bursting into life with music, and lanterns lighting the night sky. But behind the elegance, life at court could be exhausting and dangerous. Every smile could hide jealousy. Every compliment could be a trap. Letters, secrets, and rumors moved through the palace like shadows. Queens feared mistresses. Mistresses feared losing the king's favor. Ministers feared being replaced. Servants overheard everything, but spoke nothing. The king was always at the center. He slept in the most important room, aligned with the sun's path. His bedroom was placed at the heart of the palace, as if the entire world revolved around him. And that was no accident. Louis XIV designed Versailles to make everyone dependent on him, financially and politically. Life at court was a dazzling cage, filled with beauty, music, and luxury, but also with control, competition, and silent suffering. Yet for many, it was the only place where dreams could come true. As the Palace of Versailles expanded, King Louis XIV wanted a space that would reflect not just light, but power, prestige, and the glory of France. This idea gave birth to one of the most iconic and breathtaking rooms in the world, the Hall of Mirrors, or Galerie des Glaces. Originally, this part of the palace was a large open terrace overlooking the gardens. However, due to constant exposure to wind and rain, it was impractical. In 1678, Louis XIV ordered it to be transformed into a grand interior gallery, and it was designed to impress anyone who entered. The Hall of Mirrors stretches over 73 meters, 240 feet in length. It connects the king's apartments and the queen's apartments, serving as a central ceremonial passageway. Every morning, courtiers waited here to catch a glimpse of the king as he made his way through. Every night, it came alive with music, dancing, and candlelight during royal celebrations. Along one side of the hall are 17 giant, arched windows that open toward the magnificent gardens of Versailles. Opposite them are 17 matching mirrors, placed in gilded frames. At a time when mirrors were extremely rare and expensive, reserved only for the wealthiest, this was a bold statement of France's wealth and craftsmanship. In total, the hall contains 357 individual mirrors carefully arranged to reflect sunlight and candlelight, creating a golden sea of reflections. Above, the vaulted ceiling was painted by artist Charles Lebrun, the king's chief painter. The ceiling displays 30 scenes showing the achievements and victories of Louis XIV, especially during the Franco-Dutch War. The artwork celebrates the king as a victorious ruler and sun king, chosen by God to lead France. The walls and columns are decorated with marble in colors of white, red, and green. Golden sculptures of angels, fleurs-de-lis, and royal symbols line the hall. At night, more than 3,000 candles would be lit for grand events, making the mirrors shimmer and giving the illusion of endless space. The Hall of Mirrors was more than just decoration, it was a stage for politics and history. Ambassadors from foreign countries stood here to present gifts to the king. Royal weddings, dances, and ceremonies were held in this very room. One of the most important moments in world history took place here in 1919. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed, officially ending World War I, the same space that once glorified kings became a place of international diplomacy. Standing inside the Hall of Mirrors, one can still feel the echoes of footsteps, whispered secrets, and the dazzling brilliance of royal splendor. It is not only the heart of Versailles, but also a symbol of France's power, art, and legacy, forever frozen in glass, gold, and light. While the Palace of Versailles is a masterpiece of architecture, its true soul lies outside in the vast and breathtaking royal gardens. King Louis XIV believed that nature should obey the will of the king, just as people did. With this vision, he ordered the transformation of wild forests and swamps into the most magnificent gardens Europe had ever seen. The gardens were designed by André Lemaitre, a genius landscape architect. He worked for over 40 years to create this masterpiece of symmetry and elegance. Covering over 800 hectares, almost 2,000 acres, the Gardens of Versailles are a perfect example of the French formal garden style, where every tree, flower, pathway, and fountain is carefully planned and controlled. As visitors step out from the palace into the gardens, they are greeted by the Latona fountain. This fountain tells the story of Latona, mother of Apollo, the sun god, who cursed the peasants who mocked her. The fountain shows humans being transformed into frogs, a reminder of the power of the gods and, symbolically, of Louis XIV. From there, the grand perspective stretches straight ahead for nearly 3 kilometers, a long central pathway that leads the eye toward the horizon. On both sides are perfectly trimmed hedges, geometric lawns, and flower beds known as parterres. Each season, thousands of flowers are replanted to maintain the palace's beauty. The gardens are home to more than 50 fountains, 600 water jets, and 200,000 trees. Some of the most famous fountains include the Apollo Fountain, featuring the sun god, rising from the water in a chariot pulled by horses, symbolizing Louis XIV as the Sun King. The Neptune Fountain, with powerful water jets and sculptures of sea gods, it hosts spectacular water shows. The Dragon Fountain, one of the oldest, shooting water 25 meters high, depicting a dragon attacked by Cupid's arrows. Water was a major challenge. Versailles had no nearby river, so engineers designed the Marly machine, an enormous system of pumps, wheels, and aqueducts built along the Seine River to supply water to the fountains. The gardens were designed not just for beauty but for entertainment. Kings and queens hosted garden parties, theatrical performances, concerts, and fireworks. The pathways allowed the king to walk or ride his horse while being admired by courtiers. Hidden groves, known as bosquets, were created, each like a secret outdoor room with marble statues, fountains, and even music pavilions. Among the most magical places is the Grand Canal, a massive cross-shaped lake stretching nearly 1.6 kilometers. Here, the king sailed in small boats and even hosted naval battles for entertainment. The Gardens of Versailles were a statement to the world. France is powerful, wealthy, and the cultural center of Europe. Today, they continue to enchant millions of visitors every year with their beauty and harmony. Life at the Palace of Versailles was not just about beauty and architecture, it was a stage where power, politics, and strict etiquette ruled every hour of the day. The court at Versailles was a carefully controlled world where nobles lived to serve the king, hoping to gain his favor. When Louis XIV moved the royal court to Versailles in 1682, he invited hundreds of nobles, ministers, servants, musicians, guards, and artists to live at the palace. Soon, Versailles became a small city of nearly 10,000 people. Living at court was considered a great honor, but it came with many rules. Every morning began with the lever du roi, or King's Rising ceremony. At around 8:30 a.m., the king would wake up, surrounded by selected nobles who had earned the privilege of watching him get dressed. This simple act of getting out of bed became a grand performance of power. Every gesture, from handing the king his shirt to offering him his slippers, was reserved for specific noble ranks. Throughout the day, there were numerous rituals. The Grand Couvert, at 1 p.m., the king and queen ate their meals in public. Nobles and even some commoners could watch them dine in silence. The Mass, the royal family attended church daily at the Chapel of Versailles. Evening ceremonies, the Coucher du Roi, the king's bedtime ritual, was held in front of the court. Just like his morning routine, Versailles was filled with constant celebrations, banquets, masquerade balls, theater plays by operas, hunting parties, and fireworks in the gardens. Music played a major role, and composers like Jean-Baptiste Lully created masterpieces for the royal court. But life at Versailles was not as glamorous as it seemed. There were no proper bathrooms, and hygiene was poor. Perfumes and powders were used to mask odors. The palace was often crowded, noisy, and filled with gossip and rivalry. Nobles spent their days trying to gain the king's attention. They wore extravagant clothing, powdered wigs, silk coats, jeweled dresses, and towering hairstyles. The way one bowed, danced, or even held a teacup was dictated by strict rules. Every part of court life revolved around one person, the king. Louis XIV made the nobility dependent on him so they would not rebel. To stay in the king's favor meant power, titles, and wealth. To lose it meant disgrace and exile. Despite the difficulties, life at Versailles was the dream of many. It was a world of glitter and ceremony, where every day was a performance and the king was the star. By the late 18th century, the Palace of Versailles, once a symbol of ultimate royal power, began to lose its brilliance. Years of wars, high taxes, and extravagant spending had left France in deep financial trouble. Meanwhile, ordinary people were suffering from hunger, poverty, and inequality. King Louis XV, who succeeded Louis XIV, tried to maintain the grandeur of Versailles, but over time, the excitement and strict control of the court began to fade. Under Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, the palace became a symbol of excess and disconnection from the struggles of the French people. Marie Antoinette, often unfairly blamed for France's financial problems, built a private village inside the gardens called the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet. It was a peaceful escape from court life, where she dressed as a shepherdess and enjoyed a simple countryside fantasy. But to the public, this looked like mockery, a queen playing peasant while real peasants starved. In 1789, France was facing economic collapse. Food prices were rising, and people were desperate. On May 5, 1789, King Louis XVI called the Estates General, a meeting of representatives from the three social classes, clergy, nobility, and commoners, at Versailles to discuss the crisis. But instead of solving problems, tensions increased. The commoners, known as the Third Estate, declared themselves the National Assembly, demanding a new constitution and more power for the people. On June 20th, they met in a nearby indoor tennis court and took the tennis court oath, promising not to disband until a constitution was written. This marked the beginning of the French Revolution. The situation exploded on October 5, 1789, when thousands of women, angry over the price of bread, marched from Paris to Versailles. They stormed the palace, demanded food, and shouted for the king to return to Paris. Some even broke into the queen's chambers, forcing her to flee. On October 6, 1789, the king, queen, and their children were taken to Paris, never to return to live at Versailles. The court was dissolved, and the palace was abandoned. During the Revolution, Versailles was stripped of furniture, art, and treasures. Many items were sold to pay off debts. The palace, once filled with music and glittering light, fell silent and empty. The monarchy eventually ended when Louis XVI was executed in 1793, followed by Marie Antoinette. Versailles was no longer a royal residence, it became a symbol of a world that had vanished. But the story of Versailles did not end there. After the French Revolution, the grand halls of Versailles stood empty, silent reminders of a fallen monarchy. But the story of Versailles did not end with kings and queens. Instead, it transformed into something new, a monument of history, art, and memory for the world. In 1837, almost 50 years after the Revolution, King Louis Philippe decided to save Versailles. Instead of restoring it as a royal residence, he turned it into the Museum of the History of France. His goal was to unite the country by celebrating its heroes and great events, not just the glory of kings. He famously said, "A toutes les gloires de la France," to all the glories of France. Rooms that once held royal feasts and political meetings were turned into galleries filled with paintings, sculptures, and artifacts. Instead of hosting nobles, the palace now welcomed artists, historians, and visitors from across the world. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the palace underwent major restorations. Wars, weather, and time had damaged many parts of the building and gardens. Thanks to historians, architects, and charitable donors, including famous figures like John D. Rockefeller Jr., Versailles was carefully restored to its former brilliance. Today, the Palace of Versailles is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most visited monuments in the world, attracting over 8 million visitors each year. People come to see the Hall of Mirrors, the Royal Chapel, the King's and Queen's apartments, the Grand Trianon, the Petit Trianon, and the vast gardens with their fountains and sculptures. Versailles remains a place where history comes alive. Here, you can walk the same paths as Louis XIV, witness the grandeur of 17th-century art, and stand in the Hall of Mirrors where the Treaty of Versailles ended. World War I in 1919. But it is more than just a beautiful palace. It is a symbol of absolute power, of revolution, of change, and of the importance of preserving history. It reminds us of the heights of human creativity and the dangers of inequality and excess. As we leave the golden halls and peaceful gardens of Versailles, we carry with us a story that spans centuries, from a small hunting lodge to a world-famous museum. The Palace of Versailles is more than stone, glass, and gardens. It is a storyteller, whispering tales of kings and queens, of power and downfall, of art, beauty, and the people who walked its halls. Thank you for joining this journey through time.